We start this manhwa by seeing a purple portal. And boom, the woman is shot in the head style. Great way to start, I know. Startled and confused, the goon reacted with shock upon discovering a body on the floor, unable to believe what he was seeing in this tense scene. The protagonist, focused and determined, reflected on his past misdeeds, having gone rogue and made enemies among the world's most powerful mages, while aiming a shotgun at us. But we're jumping the gun, let's go back a month. The scene shifts to a tense interrogation where the protagonist, visibly distressed and nervous, remains silent as another man, standing calmly, greets him politely, acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. The protagonist, anxious and confused, questioned his captors with a worried tone, insisting that he did not understand what they wanted from him. He looked toward the suited figure, who looked like your average assassin, and Guy asked if anyone could just clarify what was going on. He sat confidently, adjusting his gloves as he identified himself as an agent of the Guild of Arcane Regulation, informing our boy that he was detaining him for suspected involvement in an attack at fitness center. Our boy, doubtful and skeptical, questioned whether the situation was a joke, while our Guy, serious and urgent, warned him that it was on the loose and he was the only conscious person at the scene. Realizing the gravity of the revelation, the man explained that magic was real and that our boy was a mage, prompting him to ask where he had been earlier that morning. We then cut to our boy who stood silently at his mother's funeral, surrounded by mourners, feeling an inexplicable sense of unease while reflecting on his loss. A mysterious aura emanated from the man standing ominously in front of the cemetery, capturing the protagonist's curious and pensive gaze. The protagonist gazed at the familiar man, his expression questioning as he recalled encounters with beings of an otherworldly presence, sensing that this moment held a deeper, mystical significance. He reflected on his own awareness, noting that while others seemed invisible to the world, he was the only one who truly saw them, recognizing his unique perception amid the contemplative scene. We then shift to outside a gym as he continued walking toward it, pondering that although he had only seen a few dozen of them, it was not rare enough for him to dismiss the sightings as mere imagination. Just then noticing the red, monstrous figure in the background who was the human actually hiding his true self, he cheerfully waved and acknowledged that he had not seen our boy in some time. Despite mentioning the claws, the protagonist explained that Mr. was not a bad guy and shared that he often spends time at his gym. The menacing dragon-like figure leaned closer, demanding that he do him a favor, which heightened the protagonist's apprehension as he listened intently to the intimidating demand. Noticing a girl over there, the man, who was winking playfully at our boy, gestured towards her and asked if he could help her out. Reflecting on the past with a relaxed smile, he mentioned that after his wife passed, the gym owner had made a point of trying to set him up with every girl that came by. Noticing her gaze, our Guy confidently, offering this girl one-on-one personal training, suggesting that the owner had mentioned she could use a bit of assistance. Just then her legs gave out as she could stand our boys. Literally, this guy is a walking panty dropper. The protagonist, overwhelmed with fear and confusion, reacted in panic upon witnessing a robbery, exclaiming that it was a robbery and clearly alarmed by the danger unfolding before him. The gym owner, alert and defensive as he attempted to shield himself from multiple attackers, shouted loudly in a desperate cry. The guy then activates his abilities. He lets out a loud roar in a pit of fury. The man then unleashes an fiery attack burning everything in his path. Startled and alert, the protagonist reacted with surprise, questioning what was happening amid the chaos caused by the fiery attack that had just been unleashed. Just then our Guy desperately fought to stay awake amid the chaos and flames, repeating to himself that he had to remain conscious despite his fear and exhaustion. As our boy passes out from the chaos, such a weak guy any normal person could walk out like a champ. Realizing he had completely passed out amid the chaos, the protagonist was overwhelmed and desperately struggling to regain his composure. We then see him urgently carrying the unconscious girl through the smoke and chaos, determined to reach safety despite the overwhelming situation. We then see an electrical wire snap on some final destination shit. The protagonist was suddenly jolted with intense pain as he struggled against the electrocution, crying out in anguish. The protagonist, showing a desperate and determined expression amidst chaos, declared that he couldn't let her die there, vowing to save her. He continued to rush through the fiery chaos, desperately determined to escape the burning building and prevent the disaster from consuming him. The protagonist, feeling desperate to survive, struggled to lift the girl in a frantic effort to save her. I guess all that time in the gym was for nothing. Just then he summoned purple energy with urgency, as his foot began to glow intensely, signaling that something was about to happen. Realizing he was outside, the protagonist, crouched beside his fallen companion amid the mysterious portal, expressed his shock and concern over his unfamiliar surroundings. He was visibly stunned and questioned the situation, reaching out with his hand as if in disbelief or confusion. Just then a figure behind him demanded to know what he was doing, intensifying the tense atmosphere as he looked up in surprise and confusion. He snapped his fingers with a glowing blue energy, issuing a commanding order to wait here, asserting his confidence amid the tense atmosphere. The man aura farming, with a single snap, extinguished the flame. The protagonist, visibly shocked and overwhelmed by the chaotic scene around him, questioned what was happening amidst the turmoil. The protagonist, still visibly distressed and confused by the chaotic scene, demanded to know what was going on, clearly overwhelmed by the situation. The man expressed his disbelief and frustration, explaining to someone he had seen Dragon Fire at its fitness center with one witness and one victim, and that the perpetrators seemed to have. Our guy then asked for an explanation, feeling like he was going crazy. Feeling overwhelmed by the chaos, he raised his hand confidently and asked what our guy's classification was, demonstrating his unwavering curiosity amidst the tense situation. The protagonist, gesturing with a questioning expression, asked what that was supposed to mean, clearly feeling confused and seeking clarification amid the tense situation. He demanded answers assertively, expressing his frustration and insisting that he would not respond unless he received an explanation. He was shocked and confused as he reacted to the unexpected clang of a mysterious bracelet slipping onto his wrist, leaving him bewildered by the strange event. The idiot focusing more on his headache rather than the fact that he just got arrested. However, before he could process the change, the uniformed authority figure shoved him forward, prompting our boy to demand in alarm what was happening. Hours later at the Guild of Arcane Regulation, while the stoic protagonist sat behind glass awaiting interrogation, two figures discussed that the man could face severe consequences for leaving a magic blocker on a suspect. A stern man in a suit, arms crossed and concern etched on his face, remarked with surprise at the protagonist's continued resilience. The man declared that our guy barely noticed the impact, which seemed to bolster his sense of calm and confidence. Standing tense beneath the blue glow, the men anxiously questioned whether there could truly be more than a mundane, since the security system should have incapacitated anyone ordinary. Just then they stated, the protagonist remained awake, and with a focused surge of magical energy, managed to evacuate the other person using an unexpected spell. However, as the tension lingered, two suited officials scrutinized the protagonist's background and expressed disbelief that someone from a mundane bloodline could be an unregistered 30-year-old magic user, while the man tasked with bringing him in insisted that solving such mysteries was not his concern. Across the interrogation table, the official remarked that the evidence was enough to clear him of suspicion and indicated they would now move on to the next matter, leaving the protagonist apprehensive about what was to come. The serious-looking man in a suit and gloves explained the registration and testing process, stating that once the protagonist's magic type was determined, their assignment for the draft could be decided. Caught off guard, the protagonist frowned in disbelief as he demanded to know what had just been said, his confusion clear. The man explained that every mage serves the Guild of Arcane Regulation, a collective introduced through an ominous tableau of masked figures standing in perfect formation, their auras glowing beneath the guild's symbol. The suited man, exuding a formal air as he sat at the table with official documents in hand, explained gravely that although this process typically began when people were much younger, the protagonist was starting later than usual. In the dimly lit room, the protagonist anxiously defended his responsibilities, insisting that he had an architecture job and clients depending on him. The suited man assured him that by the end of his service, he would have gained the skills needed for a better job. Handcuffed and sitting across from the suited man at the interrogation table, the protagonist questioned with weary resignation whether he had any real choice in the matter, or if he could simply refuse to participate. The stern man in a suit issues a chilling warning, declaring that deserters are relentlessly pursued by the guild and ultimately executed. Hearing this left our guy shocked, not knowing what to say next. Stunned and distressed, the protagonist processed the overwhelming realization of a level of tyranny he had never imagined, the oppressive atmosphere pressing down on him beneath the harsh lights. The protagonist felt an ominous force stirring within, recognizing with mounting dread that the tyranny was about to seize control over him. The protagonist, his fist clenched with determination, resolved that although the guild demanded absolute obedience or death, he would never allow himself to submit. In the dimly lit room, a suited man with glasses addressed the protagonist with an anticipatory air, asking if he was prepared for the test that awaited him. Standing beneath the harsh, tense lighting, the protagonist, visibly anxious and sweating, apprehensively asked what exactly the situation required. In response, he was informed that the warded box would overwhelm him with mana, intensifying the tension as he prepared for the magical ordeal. A glowing, rune-inscribed magical hexagon emits a mystical blue light and smoke as an unseen examiner explains that the result will reveal the protagonist's magic type. Impatient and frustrated, he demanded to know how much longer the process would take as swirling mist gathered around him. In the tense atmosphere, the man calmly estimated that only a few seconds remained, his seriousness underscoring the gravity of the moment. Startled and confused amid the swirling blue smoke, the protagonist questioned in disbelief whether only seconds had passed, admitting uneasily that he felt nothing at all. Suddenly, the protagonist let out a guttural cry of pain as he collapsed to the floor, overcome by a surge of mysterious and agonizing energy. Meanwhile, as officials in the room just stood there without a care, our guy urgently insisted the test be stopped, while the guy in the suit, maintaining composure, reassured our guy that it was almost finished. Overwhelmed by excruciating pain, the protagonist writhed helplessly, his panic screams revealing that he believed this torment would be his end. Still trembling from the ordeal, he asked if what he had experienced was normal, prompting the suited man to calmly explain that such a reaction was unusual, but likely resulted from conducting the test on someone of his age. The man then informed the protagonist that, during his absence, they had already applied the mage's mark, leaving him to touch his head in bewilderment as he tried to process this unexpected development. Staring in disbelief at the unexpected tattoo on his wrist, he wondered aloud whether they had secretly marked him while he was unconscious, his shock steadily giving way to unease. Noticing the people's indifference, he grew increasingly frustrated as he realized that freedom meant little to them. Meanwhile, the suited official informed him that being a space mage was rare, he would likely require a tutor, and the associated costs would be added to his service time, leaving him feeling even more uncertain about his future. Glaring in disbelief, the protagonist internally criticized the situation as a complete scam, his annoyance barely contained. However, despite his lingering annoyance, he cautiously asked the official if he could return home to settle his affairs before being taken away, his wariness evident as he tried to regain some control over his fate. A serious man in a suit, exuding professionalism, explained that Agent Sen would escort the protagonist and serve as his officer for the next week to help him integrate. However, when our guy greeted him and extended a handshake, the man aura-checked him, dismissing the gesture, choosing instead to focus on his phone and signaling his disinterest. As the city lights blur past the car windows, the protagonist wonders to himself how possessing spatial magic might affect his prospects in the draft, uncertainty flickering in his thoughts. However, maintaining his composed demeanor, he explains that spatial magic is primarily suited for transportation rather than offense, so the role assigned would simply be that of a porter. Our boy asked what he did, sitting calmly in the car at night. The man candidly explained that he was primarily a pyromancer fighting on the front lines, though he also possessed some skill in the dim backseat of the car, the protagonist asked with curiosity what exactly the guild fought, prompting his companion to explain that some members hunted rogue mages on Earth, while others battled on the front lines of the 6 portal worlds. Curious, he asked about the existence of portal worlds, his eyes reflecting a spark of intrigue. The man explained that, existing between Earth and the multiverse, supply mana to the planet and are fiercely protected by Gar. Now the man also revealed that each aligns with a distinct supernatural faction: vampires, shifters, fae, and sea monsters. The man, his gaze wary, reported that the 6th was empty, suspicion flickering across his face as the tense atmosphere deepened. Staring out the window into the night, the protagonist remained deeply skeptical, telling himself that he did not believe what he had just heard. Meanwhile, we transition to outside Drake's mansion, signaling the main character arrival. In a sleek office, the suited man handed the protagonist a laptop and instructed him to look up the necessary primers, prompting a sense of curiosity as he accepted the device and prepared to begin his research. With a resolute grip on the document, marked by a mysterious symbol, the man stated that he would take our guy back to the Eastern headquarters the next day. A suited man urgently instructed that everything be ready, while the protagonist listened intently. Moments later, as the tension subsided, he sat at his desk and deduced that magical energy was divided into two categories, mana and mana, an ambient magical force that mages can harness, swirled visibly around the guy as he demonstrated his confident control over its energy. He then explained that while mana is a general energy, a mage's own power is known as, which can have unique aspects such as his spatial talent. Feeling frustrated and overwhelmed, the protagonist reflected on his disadvantage, admitting to himself that he wanted to master everything, but was starting with only the basics, a handicap, given that most mage children had learned all this long ago. Sitting at his desk with determination in his eyes, the protagonist resolved to begin by attempting a small task. After surveying the scattered papers, he quietly assessed that the pen he had chosen would be light enough for the task ahead. Sitting at his desk and focusing intensely, the protagonist braced himself to activate his special ability, telling himself that all he needed was to take the next step. Channeling energy with unwavering focus, the protagonist summoned swirling mist as the pen clattered onto the surface, heightening the mystical tension in the air. As the mystical tension peaked, he unleashed a powerful burst of swirling energy from his hand, propelling it skyward with a surge of amazement and newfound control. The pen suddenly drives forward, piercing its target with brutal force as the impact reverberates through the intense scene. In the aftermath, the protagonist clenched his fist in triumph, exclaiming with palpable relief that his plan had worked. Sitting thoughtfully and glancing over his shoulder, he reflected that although he had used brute force magic by relying on ambient mana instead of his innate, the method had surprisingly worked. However, as he inspected the mysterious symbol on his wrist, he mused that serving as Gar's pack mule might offer valuable practice, though he remained wary about what such a commitment would truly entail. The Guild of Arcane Regulation, a clandestine organization comprised of the world's most powerful figures, looms at the center of the protagonist's focused investigation as he pores over information on his laptop. While typing thoughtfully on his laptop, the protagonist reflected with wary resolve that any group with such secrets could not be trusted, and he was determined not to allow himself to become merely a cog in their machine. Moments later, as suspicion lingered, he realized that Sen had deliberately omitted a crucial detail from the draft while he sifted through the scattered papers. A data screen revealed the Gar draft's chilling 52.3% death rate, citing combat, illegal activity, and contact as the leading causes, leaving the protagonist deeply apprehensive about the fatal odds. Sitting alone in his office chair, the protagonist skeptically reflected that the true motive was barely concealed, knowing it was an open secret that everything unfolding was driven by political agendas. Reflecting cynically on the ominous scene, he noted that most deaths befell mages who refused allegiance to powerful guilds, concluding that the centuries-long dominance ensured everyone either submitted to their control or faced fatal consequences. Amid the bustling office, a resigned realization settled in that those in power likely no longer needed to take any action at all. However, defiance surged through him as he slammed his hand down on the laptop, vehemently rejecting its contents and making it clear that he refused to accept what it represented. While Gar might have everyone else ready to serve, the protagonist remains unfazed. With a surge of defiance, the protagonist pushed himself up from the chair, silently vowing that he would sooner give his left nut than surrender his freedom. With a glare full of defiance, the protagonist resolved that if they wanted a rogue mage, he would become one. Opening the safe with careful precision, the protagonist resolved that if he was going to disappear, he would need to proceed with utmost caution as he gathered the stacks of money. As he carefully opened the bag to reveal stacks of cash, the protagonist remained acutely aware that a single misstep could put the entire guild on his trail. Moments later, his apprehension deepened as he pushed open the door and stepped inside, every muscle tense with the fear that danger might be waiting on the other side. As his foot pressed down on the creaking floorboard, the tense silence in the room was broken, heightening his anxiety with each cautious step forward. Suddenly, a sharp snapping sound echoed, causing the man to wake up in wide-eyed shock as the tension in the room instantly escalated. In a sudden surge of panic, the protagonist muttered a desperate curse under his breath, sweat beading on his brow as tension mounted. With urgent determination, he burst through the door, shattering the silence of the room. As night settled outside the window, the man glared into the darkness, seething with resentment as he muttered under his breath about our boy. Suddenly, clutching his head in frustration, he groaned and vowed through gritted teeth that no one would escape on his watch. Determined to follow through on his vow, he summoned a swirling green energy in his hand and asserted with cold resolve that it was time to see just how far his quarry could run. Pushed by a surge of anxiety, our guy wove urgently through the oblivious crowd, desperate to escape before panic took hold. However, as he clutched his strap and gasped for breath beneath the city lights, he anxiously admitted to himself that although he had a small head start on Agent Sen, he barely understood how magic worked and doubted how long he could keep ahead. As he walked alone down the dimly lit corridor, the protagonist warily analyzed his opponent's abilities, concluding that the man must possess some kind of mobility spell, since he claimed to be both a pyromancer and an. Suspended midair and surrounded by streams of radiant green energy, the protagonist said he might reveal his astonishing ability to fly like a super-powered jet. As dusk settles, the protagonist hurries forward, beads of sweat betraying his anxiety, as he realizes with mounting worry that escaping is impossible given the circumstances. Meanwhile, as he surged through the air with energy blazing from his hand, the man thought to himself that if the fleeing idiot didn't have a good excuse for running, he would soon find himself on Gar's bad side. However, as he landed and steeled himself for the inevitable confrontation, the guy revealed that becoming a rogue mage meant he would now be hunted by some of the guild's strongest and most dangerous agents, his jaw tightening with grim resolve. Hovering above the city street, enveloped in swirling green energy, the agent warily considered whether he should report the suspect's possible escape attempt to agent. Determined to protect his reputation, he resolved that no one could discover he had allowed the other to escape, the anxious green glow mirroring his conflicted resolve. With resolute determination, the man declared to himself that he had to handle the challenge alone as he leaped from the rooftop, energy radiating from him while he plunged toward the crowd below. Above the bustling street, the figure shrouded in glowing energy hurtles downward, while below, the protagonist weaves through the crowd, completely unaware of the imminent threat descending upon him. With fierce determination, the protagonist crashes headfirst into his opponent, the intensity of their clash echoing the high-stakes tension between them. As the dust settles from their collision, he locks eyes on his adversary with a predatory gleam, declaring with steely resolve that he has finally found his target. However, the protagonist clenches his teeth in frustration, internally cursing that his rival has arrived even sooner than he anticipated. With relentless determination, the protagonist ran through the crowded city street as he pursued the fleeing man through the chaos. Moments later, fueled by fury, he confronted the protagonist and shouted that our boy could not escape him, belittling him as nothing more than a runt who had slipped through the cracks. However, as the tension lingered, the protagonist spun back with a worried glance and wondered aloud if the others truly couldn't see the agent, anxiety etched across his face. Wreathed in swirling green energy, the protagonist raced unseen through the bustling crowd, noting that despite being inches from their faces, no one could sense his magic, and reflecting that he had chosen the crowded street to limit Sen's ability to use magic against him. Clenching his teeth in determination as sweat beads on his brow, the protagonist resolved that he would need to find another way out. With tension etched across his face, the protagonist cautiously peeks through the slightly window, scanning the inside for any sign of help. In a sudden moment of realization, he stared intensely at the jacket displayed behind the glass, surprise widening his eyes as he knew to do with it. Pushing through the crowded street with frustration etched on his face, the agent demanded to know where that idiot had gone, glowing energy swirling restlessly around his arms as he searched. Spotting our guy in the city under the cover of night, he exclaimed internally with determination upon realizing he had found his target. The agent suddenly seized his shoulder from behind, catching him completely off guard as a furious voice shouted that they had finally caught him. Startled, the random stammered out a confused question, asking if he could help the agent and struggling to comprehend how this was not the man he was after. Just then the agent turned around in vain. As he hurried forward, the unexpected sight of a bag abandoned on the ground stopped him in his tracks, a surge of surprise flashing across his face. Driven by a surge of resolve, he tore through the bag, the urgency in his movements heightened by the city lights flickering behind him. Laid out under the stark light, the shirt of our guy is uncovered, its presence intensifying the tense atmosphere. Standing there bamboozled, the man had no idea what to tell his boss now. His image is destroyed. Suddenly, anger overtakes him as he clenches his fist, crackling with energy, and furiously shouts at our boy, calling him a worthless rat. Just then, resolute in his purpose, he raised his hand to hail a taxi beneath the city's night lights. Once inside, he responded to the driver's inquiry by quietly stating his destination as Farms, his wary tone underscoring the tension in the confined space. With a serious, cautious tone, the protagonist urgently pulled down his cloak and instructed his driver to take emphasizing the need for discretion. Knowing that commercial flights were too easily monitored, the protagonist confidently explained that with some money, he could secure a ride on sealing the deal with a firm handshake beside the small red plane as the sun set behind them. Now, as he steered the aircraft through the dim light of dawn, he resolved that although the journey would be slow, he would reach the remote wilderness by early morning. Standing at the edge of the airstrip as the sun dipped low, he mused warily that while his new clothes offered some cover, they would not keep him hidden forever. Gazing resolutely into the restroom mirror, the protagonist considered that he would need an entirely new look to remain undetectable, clutching a box of hair dye as he planned his disguise. With quiet determination, he brought the scissors to his hair, each deliberate snip marking the beginning of a transformation he was resolute to pursue. Satisfied with his progress, he told himself that black would suffice and mentally prepared to tackle the paperwork that awaited him. As he paused in the doorway, the protagonist considered that obtaining a mundane ID would require finding a magical pawn shop capable of forging one. We then see a green-skinned orc-like worker behind the counter politely asked how he could assist the person approaching. Without hesitation, he firmly stated that he needed a mundane ID, his determined tone revealing the urgency behind his request. Just then the green-skinned bastard with tusks stated assertively that the price was his right arm, and his right ball this time the greedy bastard. However, the protagonist confidently countered by holding out a wad of cash and insisting that a laptop be included to seal the deal. Our boy is now a eunuch. The gloved hand carefully raised an identification card, revealing the name Chase Hall, signaling a pivotal step in covering the protagonist's true identity. With a confident grin, he reassured the other that the plan would work, adding that he had managed to stay off Gar's radar for 30 years. With firm resolve, the protagonist walked alone down the stark, white-lit path, determined that he would repeat his actions if it meant preserving his freedom. Meanwhile, in a tense modern living room, one of the men demanded to know how the protagonist had managed to escape without triggering any of the protective wards, frustration evident as the group began to realize the depth of the breach. The man, looking frustrated, defended his decision by explaining that he had only placed spells on the doors for a one-night stay, insisting there was no way he could have predicted someone would escape through a window. Maintaining his focus, he carefully inspected the scene and noted that he could detect no traces of magic, concluding with a hint of skepticism that it appeared to be nothing more than a straightforward slip-and-run. The agent, frustration clear on his face as he adjusted his glasses in the office, processed the troubling news that would not accept the decision and had already planned to begin tutoring him the next day. Still reeling from this revelation, he glanced back over his shoulder at the doorway and reflected with understanding that, knowing the circumstances, he could hardly blame the poor kid for choosing to run. With a stern glance over his shoulder, the man in the suit remarked dryly that since Agent seemed to have a sense of humor about the situation, he could be the one to deliver the news to, his tone leaving no room for argument. Just then someone inside the luxurious mansion reacted with shock, demanding clarification about the startling news they had just heard. In the midst of the tense standoff, one mage anxiously reported to that every available person was searching for the protagonist, even as he was being manhandled by the woman. The man anxiously explained that he had even sought help from the vampires and shifters, though their cooperation remained uncertain. With spatial magic being notoriously difficult to master alone, the possibility arises that he chose to abandon its pursuit for an ordinary, unremarkable existence. However, the lady, exuding smug confidence, scoffs at the notion of a mundane life as she unleashes a dramatic surge of magical energy. Suddenly, as crackling pink magic energy surged through the air and struck him down, she shouted that nobody would willingly suppress their powers, accusing the protagonist of being a rogue mage rather than an ordinary human. Overwhelmed by the oppressive purple magic swirling around him, he stammered fearfully that he would continue his search as the demanded. A stern figure, wreathed in swirling magical energy, looked down ominously and warned Agent that for both his sake and hers, she hoped he would find the person he was searching for. However, as the sinister energy intensified around her, she threatened that if our guy had indeed gone rogue, she would personally deploy her own resources to ensure the traitor was captured and executed without delay. We then see a weathered car on its last wheel pull up to a rustic house in a quiet Midwest town, its arrival breaking the stillness beneath the bright sky and hinting at new beginnings. As the woman, her voice edged with curiosity, asked the sheriff if the man before them was the one they sought, the tension lingering from the car's arrival sharpened on the steps of the old house. Stepping out of his car amid the quiet forest, the protagonist approached someone unseen and asked if the property belonged to them, responding to their inquiry about his presence with cautious curiosity. In response, the uniformed sheriff proudly introduced the smiling girl beside him as his daughter Jessica, making it clear that the property was hers. The stern-looking older man in sunglasses and a hat glares intensely at our boy. However, the tension gives way as the two hands clasp tightly, forging a brotherhood. In the warm, inviting kitchen, one of the group turned to the cautious man by the sink and asked if he was interested in the offer, prompting him to listen curiously as the possibility lingered in the air. Standing quietly indoors, the protagonist smiled thoughtfully as he considered that he might fix up the place to keep himself occupied. However, her gentle smile hinted at curiosity as she remarked that he seemed rather young to already be retired. In response, he smiled calmly and explained that he wasn't actually retired but was just taking a break for health reasons, hoping to reassure her concerns. The woman explained to the protagonist that she had been attempting to sell the property for some time, but had found few interested buyers in the area. Meanwhile, inside the kitchen, the protagonist gave a slight, confident smile as he remarked that the situation was actually advantageous for him. The next day, the protagonist sat pensively before a bag of money, reflecting that after paying for the house, he had enough to last about 2 years, yet insisted to himself that worrying about it was a luxury he couldn't afford. Determined to grow stronger, he devoted himself to unraveling the secrets of magic, poring over enchanted diagrams and notes with unwavering focus. However, he realized that unless he mastered these powers soon, Gar would inevitably catch him off guard. Immersed in research, he pored over documents explaining that space mages seemed limited to portals and minor enchantments. However, still poring over the documents, he grew visibly skeptical and muttered to himself that he didn't believe the claims at all. It seemed impossible to truly understand space without encountering, whose singular authority underscored just how monolithic Gar had become. However, as he gazed thoughtfully over the quiet forest clearing, he recalled that his very first attempt at creating a portal had happened entirely by accident. He recounts that magic is just, driven purely by subconscious will. However, as determination he focused intently and stated to himself that he would try to activate his power deliberately, channeling crackling purple energy between his hands. A swirling, radiant portal unfurled beneath his focused hand as the air shimmered with intense energy. Standing resolutely before the swirling purple energy, the protagonist braced himself and admitted he was ready to take the risk. In a sudden, surreal rush, the protagonist is yanked through a glowing portal, shock overtaking him as the world blurs around him. After successfully testing his new ability, he smiled with pride and expressed his satisfaction at the breakthrough. Outdoors, the protagonist assessed his newfound ability with a satisfied glance toward the wooden cabin, reflecting that although the distance was somewhat limited, he considered it a promising first attempt. Still fueled by curiosity, he began to ponder what other possibilities he might be able to unlock with his resourcefulness. As water streamed down around him on Monday morning, the protagonist stood alone in the shower, lost in quiet contemplation as a new day began. Noticing the empty bottle, he shook it under the shower with mild annoyance, realizing he was already out of shampoo. With mounting urgency, the protagonist reached his hand into the swirling purple portal as he called out, demanding to know where the bottle he sought was. However, as calm returned, he acknowledged the sudden appearance of the bottle. The next day, forming a sphere of is one of the first things a mage child learns, as the protagonist concentrates intently and shapes the glowing orb between his hands. With a playful glint in his eye, the protagonist conjured a swirling, luminous space ball in his palm and admitted to himself that while it might lack offensive power, he still found it undeniably cool. Standing resolutely on the wooden floor as swirling purple energy gathered in his hand, the protagonist reflected that, although all the readings claimed telekinesis belonged to force mages, he was not one of them. Focused and inventive, the protagonist explained that by countering normal gravity as a space distortion and making objects weightless, he could perform a makeshift version of gravity manipulation, all while levitating small rocks with glowing energy from his hand. However, without formal training, he admitted to himself that relying on this unconventional method, unleashing forbidden magic that sent crackling purple energy splitting the ground, was enough for now, his resolve burning amid the chaos. As sunlight filters through the trees, the protagonist sits cross-legged in the forest, channeling focused energy while a powerful aura pulses around him. Meanwhile, tapping into the ambient mana swirling around him, he focuses on his breathing and realizes that he can sense his surroundings even with his eyes closed. Building on this newfound awareness, he muses that with some effort he can even see through objects, although he notes that the range of this ability remains quite limited. Amid the swirling mist, a solitary figure walks purposefully across, their every step echoing a quiet determination. Suddenly seeing woman causes his eyes to narrow in alarm as he reacts instinctively to the unexpected disturbance. A woman glanced anxiously and called out to our boy, her voice edged with worry. Greeting Jessica with a warm smile and wave, he asked with curiosity what had brought her by. A woman calmly warned that with school starting soon, some children might try to cut through the yard despite being told not to. With a relaxed smile, the protagonist admitted in an amused tone that he hadn't yet cleared the wooded parts, brushing off the unfinished work with a light-hearted laugh. A woman offered reassurance outdoors, explaining that the local kids were quite skilled with nature, while the protagonist stood nearby, feeling a bit unsure but listening closely. With a cheerful wave, she explained that she had just dropped by while in the neighborhood and encouraged him not to be a stranger as she said goodbye outside the building. With a forced smile betraying his discomfort, the protagonist offered an awkward farewell, saying he would see them around. However, as she walked away, panic surged through him and he anxiously glanced over his shoulder, fearing that she might have witnessed his uneasy magic. Surveying the field marked by swirling traces of, he reflected thoughtfully that hours of channeling had left evidence of his energy everywhere. As he sprinted up the outdoor stairs, determination etched across his face, the protagonist resolved that he needed to find a way to suppress the lingering traces of magic. The protagonist, tense and glancing sharply to the side, worried that if anyone sensed the disturbance in his yard, his cover would be blown. We then shift across the desk. The woman in the lab coat asked him about the nature of his request, her tone businesslike as he waited, contemplative, for her reaction. The serious-looking woman in a lab coat explained to the seated man that, although their standard test confirmed our guy had never used magic, there were still some unexplained anomalies. As she examined the ring-shaped ward device in the lab, she realized with growing suspicion that she hadn't noticed the anomaly until replacing the mana supply, having discovered that the ward had already dispersed 100 of mana. Examining the supply bracelet with a serious gaze, she realized it now held only 3 units of magical energy, underscoring the urgency of the situation. In a moment of intense focus, she lamented that our guy absorbed an astonishing 97 of mana directly, never letting it reach the bracelet. Moments later, still processing his remarkable feat, he asked what it meant, prompting the woman in the lab coat to explain that his capacity already surpassed what most novice mages could manage. The serious-looking woman in professional attire questioned why the protagonist's pool was empty, reasoning that if he had never used magic or cast spells, it should have been full. The woman in a white coat, her tone tinged with uncertainty, confessed that although she did not fully understand the situation, she believed it was somehow linked to the peculiar fact that a 30-year-old mage had never sensed magic. As the man in the suit scrutinized the laptop screen, he wondered with suspicion who our boy truly was. In a misty room swirling with magical energy, the protagonist calmly measured the he had gathered, deciding that the amount was finally sufficient for his needs. With focused precision, he carefully set the metallic ball onto the platform, noting to himself that he would place it there before proceeding. Suddenly, the ball sucked the swirling, glowing vortex of energy into it. "I am not gonna risk making a joke here, guys, sorry." Amidst the charged air, he smiled with unwavering confidence and declared with pride that everything had turned out exactly as he wanted. Confidently demonstrating his resourcefulness, the protagonist explained that with the vortex pattern he discovered online, he could use ball bearings to erase any trace of his magic residue, which would help him stay hidden from Gar. Building on this momentum, he marveled at how, in just a few weeks, his mastery over magic had advanced to the point where he could effortlessly levitate a metal ring above his hand. Despite knowing he should feel happiness, the protagonist questioned why a hollow emptiness lingered inside him as he gazed downward with a conflicted smile. He comments that the day he laid his mother to rest was the day that he was propelled to flee, setting his life on a new and uncertain path. Amid the somber hush, he paused with a heavy hand, reflecting wistfully that his relentless pace had left him little time to process all he had lost. Inside the rustic cabin, the protagonist gazed upward with a wistful expression, quietly wondering to himself whether Selene would have appreciated this place. Shaking his head in frustration, the protagonist anxiously explained that he felt helpless, fearing Gar's intention to capture him and force him into labor. The protagonist, standing with defiant resolve, revealed that he had been forced to run, but insisted he would not lose. Pausing in front of Langley's cafe beneath the cloudless sky, the protagonist thoughtfully resolved that he needed to learn more about the town in order to blend in. A friendly cashier greeted the newcomer warmly, remarking with curiosity that they hadn't seen them there before. The protagonist, holding a menu with curiosity, asked the server if she had any recommendations for food as he was exploring the area, to which she replied that their steak tips were popular and hinted there was more she could suggest if he tipped well. Just then, feeling unsettled in the room filled with strange purple energy outlines, he wondered to himself about the bizarre sensation he was experiencing. As he surveyed the shadowy expanse of the underground kitchen, he mused warily that although it resembled a basement and appeared larger than expected, it could not be one. As the ominous glow intensifies, he spots the towering dog-like creature and exclaims in disbelief that such a beast, impossibly the size of a man, should not exist. Suddenly, an authoritative figure with a holstered gun confronted the anxious young man, calling out to him and making him turn around in surprise. The sheriff, tipping his hat with a casual smile, remarked that it was unusual to see him out and about, prompting the protagonist to reply in a relaxed tone that he was just checking out the local cuisine. At the bustling diner counter, the old fart proudly claimed that his niece made the best steaks, to which she responded with playful confidence, filling the scene with cheerful camaraderie. As their conversation shifted, our guy remarked with easy assurance that most local kids were well-adjusted, and none had attempted to trespass through his yard, adding to the relaxed warmth between them. With a commanding presence, the sheriff stressed that respecting territory was of utmost importance in this place. Reacting nervously to the implied words, he hesitantly wondered aloud about the concept of territory, betraying his unease with an awkward smile. At the restaurant counter, the older sheriff approached and reassured him that he didn't intend to intrude on his lunchtime, placing a steady hand on his shoulder as the protagonist listened in surprised silence. Just then the older man leaned in to whisper a confidential warning to the protagonist, cautioning him in a low voice that he had noticed unfamiliar faces nearby, and urging him to reach out immediately should anything unusual occur, leaving the protagonist tense and uneasy. The protagonist grew wary, internally questioning who these strangers might be as a bead of sweat betrayed his unease. Trying to mask his apprehension with a nervous smile, he quietly reflected on how he, too, was once the outsider, wondering aloud if anyone had ever warned others about him. A stern sheriff in uniform calmly admitted that, although he initially tried to deceive, he soon recognized the other person was not from the big city. With a grim expression, the stern older man in sunglasses clarified that he was not referring to the kind of people being discussed. A sudden thump made the protagonist's heart race as he anxiously wondered if Gar were the people the man was referring to, realizing that this could spell serious trouble. A woman informed the anxious protagonist that his order was ready, prompting him to stammer a nervous response as he accepted the bag. Standing beside the car with suspicion clouding his features, he examined the small object in his hand and reasoned that if anyone was monitoring his movements, it must be through this device. Staring anxiously at the mysterious mark glowing on his wrist, he resolved that he needed to get rid of it. However, as he sat pensively at his desk and studied the markings, he noted to himself that the magic now seemed limited to the tiny dot, symbolizing his space type. Apprehensively examining the fresh black mark on his wrist, he tried to reassure himself that it would not hurt much, believing it was only a small blob of ink. Purple energy crackled anxiously between his hands as he activated a mysterious power, the tension in the air mirroring his uncertainty. Suddenly overwhelmed by agony, he cried out, his teeth gritted as the purple energy surged through him and pain twisted across his face. As the protagonist's clenched fist began to leak a stream of ominous purple energy from his wound, a desperate surge of corrupted power was unleashed into the air. Despite the corrupted energy swirling from his wound, he grimly acknowledged that the rest of the tattoo would need to be removed eventually, but for now this partial attempt would have to suffice. Amid the roar of flames, the protagonist calmly tossed a mysterious object into the fire and commanded with unwavering determination that it should burn. The following day, as the embers faded, he sat surrounded by schematics and notes, pondering whether his small siphons could not only contain magical energy, but also release it, all while analyzing the increasing cost of their use with each new design. Reflecting on his own limitations, the protagonist likened the exhaustion from handling anything larger than a person to how a portable battery drains when charging a phone. However, considering these drawbacks, he reasoned that in a dire situation he could still charge himself with, mentally preparing to use that energy for a quick escape if necessary. Suddenly, as a sharp knock echoes through the room, the protagonist flinches at the counter, his nerves taut with unease. Meanwhile, anxiety mounting, he wonders if he should answer the door and fears that Gar might be waiting on the other side. Suddenly, two ominous figures, revealed as the sheriffs, emerge from the glowing doorway, their unexpected arrival casting a foreboding tension over the scene. Meanwhile, the protagonist cautiously greeted the older sheriff at the doorway, asking what had brought him by, as he maintained a polite but wary demeanor. Two uniformed officers appeared at the door, one politely explaining that, despite the unannounced visit, he needed to ask some questions. Anxious and confused, the protagonist questioned whether he had done something wrong, his uncertainty evident in his worried expression. A stern officer, lowering his hat with a piercing gaze, demanded to know where Mr. Hall had been around 3 a.m. the previous night. Meanwhile, lying awake in bed and staring at the ceiling, he reflected that he had suspected something for quite some time. Now, as his thoughts drifted, he found himself fixating on all the recent talk about territory, unable to quiet his restless mind. Suddenly, his attention shifted as he encountered the imposing figure of the dog-man, looming beneath a sinister, reddish-purple aura that intensified the foreboding atmosphere. The evidence now pointed unmistakably to the Langleys being shifters, yet uncertainty lingered as the protagonist wondered what message the sheriff had tried to convey back at the cafe. Just then our boy wonders inwardly if the sheriff was trying to intimidate him, or leaving him to wonder if this was actually his unique way of helping. Lying on his back and exhaling heavily, the protagonist concluded with weary resignation that he should probably hide out for a while. However, before he could settle into uneasy rest, he jolted upright in bed, startled and demanding to know what had just happened. Suddenly, as the protagonist stood with his back turned, an ominous surge of purple energy erupted around him, filling the air with tension and apprehension. At that moment, he sensed movement in the shadows and wondered with wary suspicion if an animal was lurking nearby. Peering anxiously into the distance with narrowed, glowing eyes and sweat beading on his face, the protagonist tried to make out what lay ahead, admitting to himself that it was too far to see clearly. Suddenly, the sharp clack of the door echoed through the tense night as he stepped outside the wooden house, flashlight in hand, his wariness deepening while he investigated the darkness beyond. Scanning the dimly lit bushes and trees, the protagonist whispered uncertainly that he couldn't see anything. Still feeling uneasy, he wondered aloud if he might have only imagined what he thought he saw in the darkness. Suddenly, as two officers appeared at his door and questioned him about his whereabouts at 3 a.m., the tension he felt only deepened. A stern sheriff, exuding a cautious mood, carefully explained that the questions were necessary and urged the unseen person not to get angry as the questioning began. However, noticing the tension, he hesitantly asked if something had occurred while he was asleep, his worried expression betraying both confusion and concern. The officers pressed him further, asking if he had any evidence to support his account, such as footage from a home security system, leaving him feeling increasingly uneasy under their scrutiny. The protagonist's anxiety was evident as he wondered aloud whether he needed to consult a lawyer, his worry etched across his face. However, the sheriff, maintaining a casual tone as he flipped open his notepad, reassured him that he was not truly considered a suspect and explained that he simply wanted to clear his name from the list. Standing warily beside the security system panel, he explained that although he had a security system, it consisted only of door logs without any cameras. However, he reasoned that even if cameras were installed, he couldn't risk others discovering them, especially since he often practiced magic in the backyard with caution. A. Langley, his expression grave, informed those present that there had been a murder up the street. Stunned by the revelation, he stared wide-eyed and asked in disbelief if a murder had really occurred. Two police officers approached the protagonist on the porch and asked if he had witnessed anything unusual after someone broke into Old Man Hardy's house. Facing the two sheriffs, he anxiously scratched his neck and insisted that he hadn't done it. Lost in concentration on Gar and the shifters, the protagonist failed to notice the emerging threats that now surrounded him with an intense, ethereal energy. As he looked down anxiously, beads of sweat forming on his brow, the unsettling realization dawned on him that he had never truly considered the frightening possibility of a real criminal lurking nearby. Two uniformed officers, one exuding authority and the other remaining watchful, confronted the anxious protagonist, with the older officer pointedly asking if he had any ideas. The protagonist, still uneasy, admitted that something had woken him up last night. He suspected it might have been a large animal, but confessed that was all he knew. Two uniformed officers, adopting a professional tone as they gathered information, acknowledged Mr. Hall's suggestion about an animal possibly being involved and assured him they would reach out if any further leads emerged. However, as they walked away from the cabin, the officers quietly confided to each other their suspicion that the boy was withholding information, though one insisted he could not possibly be a murderer, while the protagonist stood silently in the doorway, anxiety etched on his face. Inside the police car, the grave atmosphere deepened as one officer admitted they both knew who was responsible, confessing he had been hoping the suspicion was unfounded. At that moment, the older officer, his expression hardening behind his sunglasses, cautioned that things were about to become much more chaotic. We then see the furious sheriff slammed his hand on the desk and, confronting the shadowy figure, declared with unwavering authority that there would be no killing in his town, warning that this was packed territory and not theirs. Unfazed by the sheriff's threat, the sinister man leaned back with a smug smile and coolly, any knowledge of the incident, taunting Mr. Langley that any unfortunate mishap involving his people was his own problem. Leaning forward with a grave expression, the sheriff revealed that the victim had been killed by a vampire. However, as suspicion thickened in the air, the sheriff remarked that someone had tried to disguise the crime as something else. An older man confronted the calm, pale figure and accused him with disgust of being the kind of parasite he could sense from a mile away, though the remained unfazed by the hostility. Shrugging off responsibility, he dismissed any obligation for the stray residents, making it clear that their presence was not his concern. With a sly, confident smile, he dismissed the accusation by suggesting that, unless the other person was implying suspicion toward his own vampires, he had nothing to do with it. With a menacing glare in his red eyes, the responded seriously, stating that such an accusation was a grave matter. The sheriff, slamming the table in anger, confronted the calm man and insisted that vampires had only appeared after his arrival, declaring his intention to hold the responsible party accountable. Unfazed by the accusation, the smirked with a flash of fangs and confidently taunted the sheriff by daring him to prove his claim. The composed man, sitting elegantly with a slight smile, calmly stated that he would accept the pack's challenge if they wished to confront him. With chaotic force, the sheriff hurled the table aside in a rage of fury. The old police officer, his face twisted with anger, hurled a harsh accusation at the dark-haired that he was some sort of bloodsucker. But with a menacing glare and an ominous aura, he warned the sheriff to be careful, or he would have him by his balls. Hearing that statement made the guy rethink his whole life and what he has done up until now. Suddenly, the officer, unable to contain his frustration, barked at the deputy to remove the vampire from his sight while pointedly turning away from him. With urgency weighing on him, the overburdened authority figure reported that a mundane had been killed in town, warned that more attacks would follow since they lacked the numbers to stop the perpetrators, and confessed his frustration at being unable to reach the leader, having only encountered a lower-ranking vampire. A stern sheriff, clenching his fist with frustration, voiced his determination by stating that if he were just a little younger, he would drive that nest out of and send them back where they came from. Just then, a phone vibrated insistently, and from the device came a confrontational demand asking if the tantrum was finally over. The older sheriff, weary and resigned, reluctantly acknowledged Alpha Chester's orders with a sigh as he rubbed his neck in the quiet kitchen. Across the tense table, the person from the phone explained that without evidence Gar would support the vampires, then assured the anxious two he would send 2 members to assist, though warned they could not openly intervene if a challenge arose. Meanwhile, an older man, his tone grave as he spoke into the phone, confided his suspicion that the situation was far more complex than a mere rogue nest. With a puzzled air, the older officer questioned why they had come to, expressing his confusion over the emptiness surrounding them. In response, the man on the phone gravely revealed to the stunned two that not only, but at least 5 other towns were experiencing similar troubling issues, deepening the sense of impending crisis. Frustrated and sweating, the sheriff questioned the point of Gar's rules, expressing his doubt about their effectiveness as he challenged the system's authority. Before he could dwell on his doubts, the man, who acknowledged the people's frustration and suggested that if they could catch the offenders in the act, they would be able to eliminate them. Across the table, the figure from the phone instructed them to remain vigilant and nodded gravely as he warned that the true concern was not if the vampires would kill again. But who would the vampires kill again, as the camera pans to our oblivious boy? As he examined the item intently in the busy store aisle, the protagonist reminded himself to proceed with caution. Still weighing his options, he reasoned that although he had enough money, it was wise to keep some funds reserved for emergencies. Our guy admitted that all the recent murders and shifter troubles had left him feeling more than a little on edge. As he glanced sideways while shelving items in the store aisle, the protagonist anxiously considered that he might have to abandon altogether. However, he let out a heavy sigh and reflected that, given how much money he had invested in the place, losing it would truly be the worst possible outcome. As he sat at the table, frustrated, the protagonist considered the possibility of earning money by enchanting items and selling them, but realized that strict regulations on mage forums made this plan difficult. However, as he pressed his hand to his forehead in worry, he concluded that creating an account would jeopardize his anonymity and was therefore not an option. With a sense of urgency, the protagonist summoned a glowing magical barrier around the house, thinking that at the very least, it would have been wise to reinforce it with some protective shields. Focusing intently, the protagonist extended his hand to test a glowing, purple gravity wall he had designed to deflect bullets, though he felt frustrated knowing he had not yet found a way to sustain it for more than a minute. The protagonist reflected with quiet determination that, although greater resources might allow progress, any advanced use of spatial magic remained closely guarded by. Meanwhile, the scene shifted as he purchased ammunition at the store, while the attendant remarked with a knowing smile that he seemed to be buying some protection. With a wary yet light-hearted smile, the protagonist secured a box of shotgun shells, remarking that, given recent events, it was wiser to be prepared. The protagonist stared ahead tensely, sweat trickling down his face, as he realized with growing worry that the threat extended far beyond the recent murders. Standing tensely, the protagonist admitted to himself that he couldn't shake the feeling that Gar might be lurking just out of sight. Nevertheless, as he reached out with a wary determination, and seized a shotgun from the rack, the protagonist wondered inwardly whether a bullet would have any effect against supernaturals. Tensing as he aimed his weapon, the protagonist steeled himself for the next move, reasoning grimly that if he could be wounded, then his enemies could as well. Just with determination sharpening their voice, someone instructed the other to quickly grab a couple of mallets as the tension in the room mounted. However, as the tension lingered, the scene shifted to reveal the Langleys, two women standing together with hammers in hand, their uncertain expressions making it clear that no one expected them to be the home improvement types. The protagonist, his curiosity evident, startled the two girls by introducing himself and asking if they were both the cook and the maintenance girl, causing them to gasp in surprise. One of the girls, still gripping her tool with wide eyes, admonished him for scaring her like that, her voice betraying lingering nerves as the other girl watched with concern. Nervously rubbing his neck in the weapon-lined room, the protagonist attempted to diffuse the tension by apologizing and admitting that he was also unsettled by the murder. With a somber expression, the young woman expressed her sympathy for a girl, mentioning with quiet concern that had once attended their church. Caught off guard and feeling uncertain, the protagonist quickly clarified to the two girls that he had actually been talking about the man, not some random woman. The woman leaned in to whisper urgently that there had been a second murder last night and asked our boy if he hadn't heard, leaving the protagonist reeling in shock at the ominous revelation. Startled by the shocking news, he anxiously admitted that he had been busy all morning and questioned in disbelief whether another murder had occurred, fearing it might be the work of a serial killer. Two women, holding hands and visibly anxious, revealed that they were considering closing the cafe temporarily until the situation calmed down. In the cozy confines of the weapons shop, the protagonist offered his help to the two women, prompting one of them to express her gratitude and appreciation for his support. However, as he stepped into the hallway clutching his duffel bag and large case, a sense of urgency him when he realized that the situation had taken a dangerous turn. With a tense grip on his shotgun and worry etched across his face, the protagonist grappled with the unsettling realization that while murder was one thing, the presence of a serial killer successfully eluding even the shifters posed a far greater threat. He states that the Langley family, deeply attached to their quiet town, seemed unwilling to have Gar investigating, while grief-stricken people wept beside the sheriff and a shrouded body under the night sky. As the protagonist states, the growing number of deaths forces a grim realization that there may be no other option left. However, pushing aside his doubts, he stood before the crowded evidence board, gripping a file as he resolved that he needed to prepare for what came next. Studying the ominous investigation board, the protagonist worriedly concluded that both murders had occurred near his home and reasoned that, given the recent pattern, another might happen tonight. Deep in thought, the protagonist assessed the situation, realizing there were two significant threats looming ahead. The first threat he considered was the presence of a supernatural serial killer rumored to be on the loose. The second group consists of Gar agents who stride resolutely into the swirling, dramatic light, stepping into the unknown to begin their investigation. Tense anticipation gripped him as he clenched his teeth, mentally bracing himself for the possibility that danger could arrive at his doorstep at any moment. Determined not to be caught off guard, he expanded his spatial awareness to its limits, a glowing field radiating from the darkened cabin as he remained vigilant for any approaching threats. With urgency etched on his face, the protagonist ordered that everything be packed, his hands moving swiftly to gather clothes as he prepared to leave without hesitation. With a resolute focus, the protagonist instructed that the ball bearings be enchanted as he revealed the circular pendant hidden beneath his shirt. With a steely determination, the protagonist reminded himself to keep his weapons loaded as he snapped the shotgun into readiness. While scouting for danger with a tense gaze, he reminded himself that at the slightest sign of Gar's presence, he would need to vanish immediately. As he surveyed the duffel bags, one brimming with cash, the protagonist worriedly considered that selling the house at a loss would put additional strain on his already tight budget. Weighing his options with anxious determination, the protagonist prepared his shotgun in the kitchen, accepting that staying off Gar's radar was worth the risk. Meanwhile, he focused intently as his spatial sense expanded outward, allowing him to perceive distant corners of the quiet, moonlit town and realize that, with effort, he could even sense areas further away. As our boy becomes a peeping Tom, he sees Jessica standing quietly behind the window, observing the cafe with a calm, watchful gaze. If one is not enough, what about her sister? Meanwhile, outside the cafe, a young woman walks alone down a dimly lit alley, her tense steps hinting at unease as she heads toward the store. Sighing with exhaustion, he acknowledged to himself that the night ahead would be long as he sat beside his packed duffel bags, steeling himself for what was to come. A car pulled up quietly in front of the rustic cabin, its arrival stirring a sense of calm anticipation amid the surrounding greenery. Suddenly regaining consciousness and gripped by panic, the protagonist realized with frustration that he had blacked out as he clutched his shotgun, sweat beading on his brow. Rushing toward the door with mounting anxiety, someone called out desperately to see if the protagonist was inside. However, he soon realized it's one of the women he spied on last night, hinting at something must gone wrong, and blamed himself for it. Moments later, still anxious and sweating from regret over his reckless use of mana, he faced the woman as he asked with concern if everything was all right. However, her anxiety mounting, the woman suddenly gripped his shirt and pleaded desperately for him to help her, leaving him stunned by the urgency in her voice. Desperately clutching her arm, she called out her sister's name in a trembling voice, her panic and distress unmistakable. Suddenly, the chilling revelation that the sister had been taken echoed through the room. Desperation etched across his face. The protagonist urgently grabbed the teary-eyed woman and demanded to know who had taken her. We then shift to a group of vampires lurking in the shadows, identified their next target, whispering among themselves that she was the sheriff's loyal subordinate. Unaware of the vampire's intentions, she cautiously scanned the darkened streets, every sense alert to the danger that might be lurking nearby. A sudden, violent gust erupted, forcing the girl to shield her face as alarm surged through her. As the wind subsided, a menacing figure shrouded in darkness confronted her, greeting Het in a chilling tone that sent a deeper wave of fear through her already rattled nerves. The hooded, sinister goon confronts the terrified young woman, menacingly inviting her to join them as the air crackles with red energy, and the command to halt fills the tense atmosphere. Just then we see the poor woman falter under the vampire's control. However, as he steadied himself, the distraught woman tearfully revealed that they had lured her into the nest and now held her captive, her sobs echoing the gravity of the news he had just received. The tearful woman clutched his sleeve and begged him desperately, reminding him that he had promised to help. Startled by her plea, he flinched back with sweat beading on his brow, confessing in distress that he had no idea what he was supposed to do. The protagonist pensively questioned whether he should accept the existence of the supernatural as reality. As uncertainty clouded his thoughts, he wondered if he could truly persuade the women that he was not a mage, recalling how she had discovered him before she could conceal he. Sensing her anxiety, he gently urged they head inside for safety, while she hesitantly agreed, still visibly shaken from the recent confrontation. The protagonist gripped her shirt with determination, convincing himself that he had no choice but to remain resolute and rescue the girl from the vampires. However, his worry mounting, he confronted the woman, urgently pressing her to clarify if the girl was still alive rather than killed, his hand revealing the long gun on the table as the tense moment unfolded. A worried young woman looked downward, her voice hesitant as she reluctantly said she was still alive. Our guy claimed that at his puny level there was no way he can take out a group of vampires, there is no way he is Sung Jinwoo. Just then, the woman grabbed his arm in the hallway and pleaded desperately for him to save her, causing him to pause uneasily at her touch. With gentle resolve, the protagonist clasped her hands and promised that he would do everything he could to help. He grabbed a shotgun and, with a serious expression, contemplated the situation, realizing that he would need more information before taking any further action. Nervously gulping, he wondered if he was making a mistake as doubt crept into his thoughts. The scene shifts as the main character's dusty, rusty, and broke car pulls up outside a motel. Just then, looking out the car window, he thinks to himself that he's feeling something unnatural. Suspicion clouded the protagonist's mind as he sat in his car, warily observing the motel and sensing that something supernatural was at play. Meanwhile, outside the motel, a woman stood by the door, smoking with a contemplative look as she piqued our boy's interest. Seeing the concern on his face while she offered reassurance, she stated that her family could help him. As the protagonist stepped through the door, His eyes widened in shock at what he was seeing. As he stood amid the menacing crowd, the protagonist warily realized that everyone surrounding him was a shifter. Startled and concerned, the sheriff exclaimed what she was doing as he witnessed a tense confrontation unfolding before him. The sheriff, his demeanor fierce and defiant, commanded that Gar be kept out of the situation for now. Startled and breaking into a nervous sweat, he suddenly realized with growing anxiety that the sheriff believed he was involved with Gar. He boldly asserted that he did not know the sheriff and had never been there, demanding to be understood, as his resolve remained unwavering despite the tense atmosphere. The sheriff, without hesitating, let out a deafening roar. With defiant resolve, the sheriff challenged the menacing by loudly demanding if they all had heard his words, his voice cutting through the tense standoff. The protagonist, sitting on a chair with a confident and inquisitive expression, as the sheriff asked what he could do, reflecting his curiosity about his own capabilities. Refusing to cooperate, the protagonist declared that he would not answer questions, but would appreciate being kept informed of any developments. The protagonist listened intently as the man warned that the vampires had taken over the motel down the street and were making a move to claim their territory. He then explained he sensed that they had a mage with them and recalled that he had been feeling a strange presence all week. The sheriff reflected on the grim reality that their little nest had already claimed 2 lives, deepening the somber mood and his worried contemplation. The protagonist, filled with frustration, passionately confronted the older figure and demanded to know why they had not taken action after realizing they knew who was responsible. Realizing the limitations of their strength and the strict supernatural agreements, he explained that the pack alone was insufficient to challenge their enemies and that no other supernaturals could intervene without concrete proof. He emphasized that shifter packs are helpless and warned that if they intervene, Gar would blame them as the aggressors, expressing his frustration over the supposed peacekeeping guild's failure amidst the tense confrontation. The protagonist, looking surprised and slightly apprehensive as he raised a question about the agreements, sought clarification in the tense atmosphere. He focused intensely, reaching out with his mana sense to determine if she was in that motel. Using his powers, we then see figures hanging out in the hotel. Moments later, our boy manages to find the held captive using his powers. The sheriff said they claimed she was there of her own free will, but he remained pensive. He burst into a fit of rage, claiming the bullshit story of her being held hostage of her own free will. He looked directly at the sheriff with a worried expression, contemplating the critical question of what might happen if he managed to bring her back. Once she was free, they planned to contact Alpha Chester to send the rest of the, believing that with reinforcements, they would be strong enough to challenge the bloodsuckers and drive them out of. Ignoring what he just heard, with a sweat bead dripping from his face, our boy questions how to kill a vampire. My guy, it's folklore, I think we all know how. Despite his concern, our boy listened, as the elder explained that weaponry could stop their regeneration. But unfortunately, they lacked any such weapons, since they were broke as shit. He analyzed that a sufficiently powerful blow to the brain or heart would be effective, as evidenced by the large, bloodied heart pierced by a wooden stake. Holding his shotgun with an itchy trigger finger, he asked the man if weapons would suffice. The sheriff recognized that they were fast bastards and that landing a clean blow would be a challenge, if our idiot boy had thought of that. Glaring at who knows, our boy stated that this fight ahead would be easy, obviously. Standing up with aura and holding his shotgun, he stated with confidence that he would bring the girl back safe and sound. But before departing on his mission, he asked the group for help, as he was going to need a few things to prepare.